Once upon a time, in a quaint coastal village surrounded by tall cliffs and lush greenery, there lived an old fisherman named Edward. His life was as simple as the tiny wooden house he called home. The house, perched atop a hill, had a creaky door, a small garden where Edward grew herbs, and a cozy chair by the window where he often sat, gazing at the sea. The ocean was everything to Edward. It was his livelihood, his inspiration, and, on many days, his only companion. But in recent years, the sea had been less generous. The fish seemed fewer, the waters colder, and the work harder. Yet Edward remained steadfast. Patience, he would tell himself, his voice soft but determined. The sea always provides to those who respect her. Every morning, long before the sun kissed the horizon, Edward would wake up to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. He would light a lantern, brew a cup of tea, and pack a small lunch, usually a piece of bread and some cheese. On this particular morning, the air was colder than usual, and the stars were still scattered across the dark sky. Edward stepped out of his house, his fishing net slung over his shoulder. He paused for a moment, looking out at the sea, its surface shimmering faintly under the moonlight. Another day, another chance, he murmured, beginning his descent down the rocky path to the shore. The beach was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the waves. Edward pushed his small wooden boat into the water and climbed in, his hands steady despite his years. Rowing out to his favorite spot, he felt a familiar sense of peace. Edward cast his net into the water and waited. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Birds chirped, and the village behind him slowly came to life. But Edward's net remained empty. Time after time, he pulled it back only to find nothing but seaweed or the occasional crab. His stomach growled and his hands ached, but Edward didn't give up. "Just one fish," he whispered, his voice tinged with hope. "That's all I need for today." As the hours passed, Edward began to feel the weight of disappointment. The sun was now high in the sky, and the heat made his forehead glisten with sweat. He was about to give up when he felt a sudden tug on his net. Edward gazed at the tiny fish thrashing in his net. Its scales shimmered like liquid silver, catching the sunlight in an almost hypnotic display. But what truly froze Edward was the soft, clear voice that came next. "Please," the fish said, "spare my life. I'm too small to make a difference today, but if you show mercy, I promise you'll gain more than you lose." Edward blinked, wondering if hunger or exhaustion was playing tricks on him. He leaned closer, his rough, calloused hands trembling as he tightened his grip on the net. "You're talking," Edward muttered. "A talking fish? That's new." "Yes," the fish replied, wriggling with effort. "But we don't have much time. I know you're struggling, Edward. The sea hasn't been kind. But if you let me go, you'll find a reward beyond what you can imagine." "How do you know my name?" Edward asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. The fish stilled, its glimmering eyes locking onto Edward's. "The ocean knows many things. Trust me, old man. Let me live, and you'll see the truth of my words." Edward sighed, his mind warring with doubt. The catch was pitiful, and his empty belly groaned as a cruel reminder. But as he looked into the fish's eyes, something in him shifted. "Fine," he said, loosening the net. "But if you're lying, I'll be the laughingstock of the entire village." "You won't regret this," the fish said softly. With that, Edward dipped his hands into the cool, salty water and released the fish. It lingered for a moment, its silver body gleaming in the fading sunlight, before diving into the depths with a final flick of its tail. As Edward rowed back to shore, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that something extraordinary had just occurred. The empty basket beside him felt heavier than ever, filled with the weight of hope and uncertainty. Edward sat back in his boat, holding the tiny fish in his hands. He was torn. On one hand, he hadn't caught anything else all day. This fish, though small, could still make a modest meal. On the other hand, he felt a strange connection to the creature. "You're a brave little one," Edward said after a long pause. "All right, I'll let you go. But remember your promise." With that, he gently lowered the fish back into the water. It swam away quickly, its shimmering scales disappearing into the deep blue. As Edward rowed back to shore, his net empty, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. The following days were difficult for Edward. He returned to the sea each morning, casting his net with hope. But his luck didn't improve. His neighbors began to notice his empty baskets and whispered among themselves. One evening, as Edward sat by his small fireplace, his friend Thomas paid him a visit. "Edward," Thomas said, shaking his head, "I heard about that talking fish you let go. Why would you do such a thing? You're too soft-hearted for your own good." Edward smiled faintly. "Sometimes, kindness feels like the only right choice, Thomas. Who knows what the sea has planned?" Thomas sighed, clearly unconvinced. "I just hope the sea rewards you soon, my friend." Weeks turned into months. Edward continued his routine, his faith in the ocean unshaken. Then, one morning, something extraordinary happened. As Edward cast his net, it grew heavy almost immediately. His heart raced as he pulled it in, his muscles straining against the weight. When he finally saw what was inside, he gasped. It was the little fish, now grown into a magnificent creature with scales that sparkled like diamonds. "It's me, kind fisherman," the fish said in a deep, melodious voice. "I've returned to repay your kindness." Edward was speechless. The fish gestured toward the horizon with its tail. "Follow me," it said. Edward rowed after the fish, his boat cutting through the calm waters. They traveled to a secluded cove surrounded by towering cliffs. "Cast your net here," the fish instructed. Edward hesitated but did as he was told. When he pulled the net back up, it was filled with the most beautiful fish he had ever seen. Each one was plump and vibrant, their scales shimmering in the sunlight. "These fish are my gift to you," the talking fish said. "Your kindness brought me to this moment, and now I want to share the ocean's bounty with you." Tears filled Edward's eyes. "Thank you, my friend. I'll never forget this." When Edward's boat reached the shore, the entire village stood waiting. Whispers spread like wildfire as they saw the sheer abundance of fish spilling out of his boat. "Edward, where did you find all this?" Thomas called out, his voice a mix of shock and awe. The old fisherman smiled, stepping out of his boat with deliberate calm. "Patience, my friends," he said, raising a hand. "Let me tell you a story." The villagers pressed closer, their curiosity palpable. "A long time ago, I caught a fish. Small, too small to bother with. But it spoke to me. It begged for its life, promising a reward if I let it go. I didn't believe it at first. Who would?" Edward chuckled, his tone light. "But something told me to trust it," he continued. "So, I let it go. Days passed, then weeks. I wondered if I'd been a fool." The crowd hung on his every word. Then, this morning, I returned to the sea. The little fish came back, bigger and stronger. It led me to a hidden place where the waters shimmered with life. The fish you see in my boat are its gift, not just to me, but to all of us. A hush fell over the villagers, the weight of Edward's words sinking in. Thomas stepped forward, his voice trembling. "You've shown us something incredible, Edward. Kindness isn't just a virtue. It's a force that changes lives." Edward smiled, his eyes twinkling with gratitude. "Kindness is like the ocean. It comes back to you in waves." From that day on, Edward's story became the heart of the village. Fishermen took only what they needed, and the community grew stronger, united by the simple truth Edward had shared. Years later, a statue of Edward holding a tiny fish was erected by the shore. Below it, a single line was etched: "Kindness catches what the net cannot." And so, dear listeners, remember, no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Just as the sea returns what you give it, so does life. Keep casting your net with hope and kindness, and you'll find treasures beyond your dreams.